I would like to thank ASTMH for giving me this opportunity to talk this morning. I'm Prabin Dahal, a PhD student with Worldwide Antimalarial Resistance Network, and I'm going to present about statistical methods for deriving efficacy in antimalarial efficacy studies on behalf of the study group. So in antimalarial studies, patients come to the clinic and they are given treated on day 0, day 1, and day 2 on a 3-day regimen, and they are followed up for at least a minimum period of 28 days. And at the end of the study, the outcome, each of the patients are given an outcome. With the current antimalarial regimen, a large fraction of these patients are cured, whereas in a small proportion of the patients, they go and develop recrudescence, which is the same parasite which caused the initial disease, causing the second episode of the disease again. Whereas in some patients, especially in the areas of high transmission, they can also develop new infections. And usually recrudescence and reinfections, the recurrences are separated using PCR genotyping methods. And one way of thinking about these two events is to think that they are competing against each other. For example, if a patient develops new infection during the follow-up, it prevents the recrudescence from being observed as the first event. And when a patient develops recrudescence, then reinfection cannot be observed as the first event, because they are given alternative treatment on the day of recurrence. In the statistical literature, they are referred to as competing risk events. It has been widely acknowledged in cardiovascular and oncology studies, but is yet to find any sort of application in antimalarial context. And the traditional the approach that we currently take in handling this competing risk event is to censor them in Kaplan-Meier survival analysis. And I'll begin with a small motivating example showing you why it can be problematic in certain situations. Using data from Uganda in chloroquine and SP arm in early 2000 in 166 patients in children population treated with chloroquine plus SP. The follow-up duration was day 28, and using the conventional Kaplan-Meier approach, the recrudescence estimate on day 28 was 37.6%. This is Kaplan-Meier method where new infections are censored. And similarly, when you derive the estimate for new infections where recrudescence are treated as censored, the estimates were 76.1%. Now, when you add these two things together, they sum to more than 100%. So this immediately tells you that censoring the competing risk event in survival analysis can be problematic, and we lose the interpretation of the estimate as probability because they are summing to more than 100%. And since they sum to more than 100%, each of the individual components of the failure are overestimated, and we need an alternative approach of handling new infections when deriving failure estimate. And one such estimate is the so-called the cumulative incidence function, which accounts not only for recrudescence when deriving failure estimates, but now when you derive failure estimates, they depend not only on recrudescence but also the proportion of the patient who develop new infections. And it has been widely reported in statistical literature that the failure estimates derived by using the Kaplan-Meier method, where the competing risk events are censored, are always overestimated compared to this cumulative incidence function, which is the objective of this project is to quantify this overestimation in failure purely down to the choice of the statistical method when we censor the competing risk event in Kaplan-Meier analysis compared to this cumulative incidence function for antimalarial regimens. In order to do that, we looked for studies which were part of the WARN repository and which satisfied these following inclusion criteria for studies in p-falciparum. And we looked for these studies with this 4 widely used ACT regimen: artemethyl lumefantrine, artesunate amodiaquine, DHA-piperacin, and artesunate mefloquine. And essential criteria was that PCR genotyping was used to differentiate those recrudescences from reinfections. Our unit of analysis was a study arm, which was defined as the combination of a study site, treatment, and study ID. And for each of the study arm, we generated failure estimate at the end of the study using the conventional Kaplan-Meier method, where the reinfections were censored, and also using the cumulative incidence function, which appropriately accounted for the competing risk event. And we computed the differences between these two methods, the failure estimates derived between these two methods, and looked at what are the factors that influenced these estimates. And we also performed simulation studies looking at different scenarios of recrudescence and reinfections which could be observed in the field trial, and summarized results from 1,000 different runs. In total, there were 92 studies included in the analysis carried out in Asia, Africa, and South America over the last 2 decades. Primarily, majority of the patients were treated with artemethyl-lumefantrine, DHA piperacin, artesunate amodiaquine, and 4% of the patients received artesunate mefloquine, and from a total of 233 different treatment arms. Out of these 233 arms, in 91 arms, we didn't observe, there were no recrudescence or new infections. In those arms, the estimates of the failure is exactly identical between these two methods. And in the remaining 142 arms, the overestimation of failure by using the conventional Kaplan-Meier method was really marginal. Just the overall median difference was only observed in 2 decimal point places. However, you can see that in some situation, it can be covered as extreme as 3.6 percentage point difference in the failure estimates. And we found this difference to increase with follow-up duration. For example, on day 28, the difference was very minimal, and it was found to increase when we compared at day 42 and day 63. So again, the median, when you look at the median, there might not be much difference between the two methods, but in some extreme scenarios, the difference could be as high as 3% or 4%. And in order to understand when do we observe this large differences, we conducted simulation studies, because in this studies included in the analysis, the efficacy of drug observed was very high, in excess of 95%. So in order to look at the scenarios of different combination of new infections for different proportion of recrudescence, we looked at simulation studies, and we began with the scenarios which closely replicates the data which was included in the analysis, which is we assumed 5% recrudescence failure would be observed in a clinical trial of size 200, and then we simulated 4 different scenarios of new infections which could be observed in a study representing areas of different transmission endemicity. For example, we looked at less than 10%, 10 to 20%, 20 to 40, and more than 40% new infections observed in a trial where 5% of the recrudescence was observed. And again, we derived the failure estimates using these 2 methods, Kaplan-Meier and the cumulative incidence function method, and summarized the difference, the overestimation in failure by the Kaplan-Meier method on the y-axis. As you see, as the proportion of new infections observed in a study increases, the magnitude of the overestimation increases, and in areas of high transmission, for example, which is the more than 40% new infections observed in the study, the magnitude could be as high as 3%, which closely resembles to the data I presented earlier, thus validating our simulation setup. And in order to look at what happens when drugs start to fall in efficacy, and then we simulated scenario exactly same. We looked exactly same proportion of new infections, but we looked at 10% recrudescence was observed in the study. Now again, when you compare to the last slide, we see exactly similar trend, that the overestimation increases with increasing new infections being observed in the study. But now the magnitude is much higher compared to the earlier slide. In areas of high transmission, the difference in efficacy could be as high as 5%, and this could be quite critical. For example, if you observe a failure of 11% in a study conducted in areas of high transmission, the failure could actually be 7% or 8%. So this differences in failure estimate can be sort of entirely down to the choice of the statistical method, not for the clinical reason. So it's important that we recognize the fact that the failure estimates derived in antimalarial study can be sort of highly affected by the choice of the statistical method. So to conclude, ignoring competing risk events can lead to misleading conclusions. In the studies included in the analysis, we found that the magnitude of overestimation was marginal, as the efficacy of the drug regimens remained really high. Whereas through the data and through the simulation studies, we explored the scenarios where competing risk events could be helpful to gain an insight into the true estimates of the failure. And we recommend that in high transmission settings, competing risk method should be used. And this is not only my work, this is work of more than 100 co-authors who have sort of joined forces to be part of the methods study group, and I'd like to thank each and every of them. And with that, I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have we got any questions from the audience? Okay. I have sort of one. When you were doing your simulation studies and you were applying a sort of assumed sort of recrudescence versus sort of an additional infection, were you applying the rates of, say, a new infection equally across your population, or did you have sort of new infections occurring more often in, say, some individuals in the population?
That's a very good question. For example, when we are doing simulation, we restricted to children less than 5 years. So we assumed what would the baseline rate observed in that population, and we fixed in that only population. So
that's a pretty good idea.
Right. Okay.
So I just have a question about the markers, the PCR that you were using to determine whether something's classified as a recrudescence or a reinfection. So that was with a single, was that microsatellite, or, and that follows up, I mean, to what extent do you think that accurately reflects what's going on? Because, I mean, has that been compared with whole genome sequencing in terms of assessing whether that's super reliable?
Yeah, that's a really important point. For example, in this analysis, there are sort of retrospective studies. That's part of the WARN repository, and the different studies use different markers for genotyping. So different labs use different methods. So the widely used markers, so the majority of the studies use the 3 markers: MSP1, MSP2, and GLERB. Whereas there are some studies which use only 1 or 2 markers, and some studies use microsatellites as well. So one of the caveats, limitations of this analysis is that we assumed whatever the PCR classification was provided to WARN by the PI, we took that as a true outcome. But we sort of acknowledge the limitations around PCRs is challenging and is beyond the scope of this analysis.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much.
Right, thank you.